To more fully understand Bobby's parents and others like them, it is necessary that first we draw the distinction between evil and ordinary sin. It is not their sins per se that characterize evil people. Rather, it is the subtlety and persistence and consistency of their sins. This is because the central defect of the evil is not the sin, but the refusal to acknowledge it. Bobby's parents, except for their evil, are most ordinary. They live down the street, on any street. They may be rich or poor, educated or uneducated. There is little that is dramatic about them. They are not designated criminals. More often than not, they will be solid citizens, Sunday school teachers, policemen, or bankers, and active in the PTA. How can this be? How can they be evil and not designated as criminals? The key lies in the word designated. They are criminals in that they commit crimes against life and liveliness. Their crimes are so subtle and covert that they cannot be clearly designated as crimes. I have spent a good deal of time working in prison with designated criminals. Almost never have I experienced them as evil people. People in jail can almost always be assigned a standard psychiatric diagnosis of one kind or another. The men and women I talk about, such as Bobby's parents, have no such obvious defects and do not fall clearly into our routine psychiatric pigeonholes. This is not because the evil are healthy. It is simply because we have not yet developed a definition for their disease. Since I distinguish between evil people and ordinary criminals, I also obviously make the distinction between evil as a personality characteristic and evil deeds. In other words, evil deeds do not an evil person make. Otherwise, we should all be evil, because we all do evil things. Sinning is most broadly defined as missing the mark. This means that sin is nothing more and nothing less than a failure to be continually perfect. Because it is impossible for us to be continually perfect, we are all sinners. We routinely fail to do the very best of which we are capable. And with each failure, we commit a crime of sorts against God, our neighbors, or ourselves, if not frankly against the law. Of course, there are crimes of greater and lesser magnitude. It is a mistake, however, to think of sin or evil as a matter of degree. It may seem less odious to cheat the rich than the poor, but it is still cheating. If evil people cannot be defined by the illegality of their deed or the magnitude of their sins, then how are we to define them? The answer is by the consistency of their sins. While usually subtle, their destructiveness is remarkably consistent. This is because those who have crossed over the line are characterized by the absolute refusal to tolerate the sense of their own sinfulness. I commented that George, blessed by guilt, managed to turn away from becoming evil. Because he was willing, at least to a rudimentary degree, to tolerate the sense of his own sinfulness, he was able to reject his pact with the devil. Had he not borne the pain of the guilties he experienced over the pact, his moral deterioration would have continued. More than anything else, it is the sense of our own sinfulness that prevents any of us from undergoing a similar deterioration. A predominant characteristic of the behavior of those I call evil is scapegoating. Because in their hearts they consider themselves above reproach, they must lash out at anyone who does reproach them. They sacrifice others to preserve their self-image of perfection. Evil, then, is most often committed in order to scapegoat. and the people I label as evil are chronic scapegoaters. They attack others instead of facing their own failures. As life often threatens their self-image of perfection, evil people are often busily engaged in hating and destroying that life, usually in the name of righteousness. The fault, however, may not be so much that they hate life as that they do not hate the sinful part of themselves. I doubt that Bobby's parents deliberately wanted to kill Stuart or him. I suspect that their murderous behavior was totally dictated by an extreme form of self-protectiveness, which invariably sacrificed others rather than themselves. What is the cause of this failure of self-hatred? This failure to be displeasing to oneself, which seems to be the central sin at the root of the scapegoating behavior of those I call evil. The cause is not, I believe, an absent conscience. There are people, both in and out of jail, who seem utterly lacking in conscience or superego. Psychiatrists call them psychopaths or sociopaths. Guiltless, they not only commit crimes, but may often do so with a kind of reckless abandon that is not particularly characterized by scapegoating. This is hardly the case with those I call evil. Utterly dedicated to preserving their self-image of perfection, they are unceasingly engaged in the effort to maintain the appearance of moral purity. They worry about this a great deal. They are acutely sensitive to social norms and what others might think of them. Like Bobby's parents, they dress well, go to work on time, pay their taxes, and outwardly seem to live lives that are above reproach. The words image and appearance and outwardly are crucial to the understanding of the morality of the evil. While they seem to lack any motivation to be good, they intensely desire to appear good. Their goodness is all on a level of pretense. It is, in effect, a lie. This is why they are called the people of the lie. Actually, the lie is designed not so much to deceive others as to deceive themselves. They cannot or will not tolerate the pain of self-reproach. The decorum with which they lead their lives is maintained as a mirror in which they can see themselves reflected righteously. Yet the self-deceit would be unnecessary if the evil had no sense of right and wrong. We lie only when we are attempting to cover up something we know to be illicit. Some rudimentary form of conscience must precede the act of lying. There is no need to hide unless we first feel that something needs to be hidden. We come now to a sort of paradox. I have said that evil people feel themselves to be perfect. At the same time, however, I think they have an unacknowledged sense of their own evil nature. Indeed, it is this very sense from which they are frantically trying to flee. The essential component of evil is not the absence of a sense of sin or imperfection, but the unwillingness to tolerate that sense. At one and the same time, the evil are aware of their evil and desperately trying to avoid the awareness. Rather than blissfully lacking a sense of morality, like the psychopath, they are continually engaged in sweeping the evidence of their evil under the rug of their own consciousness. For everything they did, Bobby's parents had a rationalization, a whitewash good enough for themselves, even if not for me. The problem is not a defect of conscience, but the effort to deny the conscience its due. We become evil by attempting to hide from ourselves. The wickedness of the evil is not committed directly, but indirectly as part of this cover-up process. Evil originates not in the absence of guilt, but in the effort to escape it. In The Road Less Traveled, I suggested that laziness, or the desire to escape legitimate suffering, lies at the root of all mental illness. What distinguishes the evil, however, from the rest of us mentally ill sinners is the specific type of pain they cannot tolerate. The pain of their own conscience, the pain of the realization of their own sinfulness and imperfection. If the central defect of the evil is not one of conscience, then where does it reside? The essential psychological problem of human evil, I believe, is a particular variety of narcissism that Erich Fromm called malignant narcissism. Narcissism, or self-absorption, takes many forms. Malignant narcissism is characterized by an unsubmitted will. All adults who are mentally healthy submit themselves one way or another to something higher than themselves, be it God or truth or love or some other ideal. To a greater or lesser degree, all mentally healthy individuals submit themselves to the demands of their own conscience. Not so the evil, however. In the conflict between their guilt and their will, it is the guilt that must go, and the will that must win. They are men and women of extraordinary willfulness. There is a remarkable power in the manner in which they attempt to control others. Indeed, it is almost tempting to think that the problem of evil lies in the will itself. Perhaps the evil are born so inherently strong-willed that it is impossible for them ever to submit their will. Yet I think it is characteristic of all great people that they are extremely strong-willed, whether their greatness be for good or for evil. The strong will, the power and authority of Jesus radiates from the Gospels, just as Hitler's did from Mein Kampf. But Jesus' will was that of his Father, and Hitler's that of his own. The crucial distinction is between willingness and willfulness. There are many ways to look at the genesis of human evil. The fact of the matter is that some of us are very good and some of us very evil, and most of us are somewhere in between. We might therefore think of human good and evil as a kind of continuum. As individuals, we can move ourselves one way or another along the continuum. Just as there is a tendency for the rich to get richer, however, and the poor to get poorer, so there seems to be a tendency for the good to get better and the bad to get worse. Erich Fromm saw the genesis of human evil as a developmental process. We are not created evil or forced to be evil, but we become evil slowly over time through a long series of choices. I applaud his view, particularly its emphasis upon choice and will. I think it is correct as far as it goes, but I do not think it is the whole truth of the matter. On the one hand, it does not take into account the tremendous forces that tend to shape the being of a young child before it has much opportunity to exercise its will in true freedom of choice. On the other hand, it perhaps underestimates the very power of the will itself. In my view, the issue of free will, like so many great truths, is a paradox. On the one hand, free will is a reality. We can be free to choose with conditioning or other factors. On the other hand, we cannot choose freedom. There are only two states of being: submission to God and goodness, or the refusal to submit to anything beyond one's own will, which refusal automatically enslaves one to the forces of evil. We must ultimately belong either to God or the devil. We must choose.
People of the Lie, The Hope for Healing Human Evil, was written and read by M. Scott Peck. It was abridged for audio by Judith Benenson. The recording engineer was Rick Bradley. Post-production by Paul Fowley. The associate producer was Elisa Shokoff. People of the Lie, The Hope for Healing Human Evil was directed and produced by Carol Shapiro. People of the Lie, The Hope for Healing Human Evil by M. Scott Peck, the author of The Road Less Traveled, Book 3, Possession and Group Evil. Dr. Peck.
Having come over the years to a belief in the reality of benign spirit, or God, and a belief in the reality of human evil, I was left facing an obvious intellectual question. Is there such a thing as evil spirit, namely the devil? I thought not. In common with 99% of psychiatrists and the majority of clergy, I did not think the devil existed. Still, priding myself on being an open-minded scientist, I felt I had to examine the evidence. It occurred to me that if I could see one good old-fashioned case of possession, I might change my mind. I let it be known that I was interested in observing cases of purported possession for evaluation. Referrals trickled in. The first 2 cases turned out to be suffering from standard psychiatric disorders. The third was the real thing. Since then, I have also been deeply involved with another case of genuine possession. In both cases, I was privileged to be present at their successful exorcisms. These 2 were highly unusual, in that both were cases of satanic possession. I now know Satan is real. I have met it. The listener will naturally be disappointed, even skeptical, that I am not going to describe either of these cases in depth. The reason is that I don't hope to convince the listener of Satan's reality. Conversion to a belief in God generally requires some kind of actual encounter, a personal experience with the living God. Conversion to a belief in Satan is no different. There is no way I can translate my experience to make it yours. It is my hope, however, that as a result of my experience, closed-minded listeners will become more open-minded to the reality of evil spirit. One might think of exorcism and psychotherapy as utterly different, mutually exclusive approaches. The 2 exorcisms I witnessed, however, both seemed to me to be psychotherapeutic processes, in method as well as outcome. Indeed, a week after one exorcism, the patient who had been seeing psychiatrists for many years exclaimed, "All psychotherapy is a kind of exorcism." And, in my experience, all good psychotherapy does, in fact, combat lies. The differences between psychoanalytic psychotherapy and exorcism fall into 2 categories: conceptual frames of reference and the use of power. The conceptual frames of reference of Christianity and psychoanalysis need not be mutually exclusive. I have been combining them in various mixtures in ordinary psychotherapy for some time with many patients and apparently with considerable success. As to the use of power, psychoanalytic psychotherapy and exorcism are radically different. Traditional psychotherapy, whether it be psychoanalytically oriented or not, deliberately makes little or no use whatsoever of power. It is conducted in an atmosphere of total freedom. The patient is free to quit therapy at any time, and the therapist has no weapons with which to push for change beyond the persuasive power of his or her own wits, understanding, and love. Exorcism is another matter. Here the healer calls upon every power that is legitimately, lovingly available in the battle against the patient's sickness. First of all, exorcism, as far as I know, is always conducted by a team of at least 3 or more. In a sense, the team gangs up on the patient. Unlike traditional therapy, in which it is one, quote, against, unquote, one, in exorcism, the patient is outnumbered. The exorcism team, through prayer and ritual, invokes the power of God in the healing process. For the non-believer, this may seem like an ineffective measure, or else its effectiveness would be explained in terms of the mere power of suggestion. Speaking as a believer, I can only offer my personal experience of the presence of God in the room during the exorcisms I witnessed. Indeed, as far as the Christian exorcist is concerned, it is not he or she who successfully completes the process. It is God who does the healing. The whole purpose of the prayer and ritual is to bring the power of God into the fray. So it is that exorcism is seen by its practitioners in terms of spiritual warfare. The exorcist believes it is legitimate to use any and every loving means that can be summoned or otherwise made available in the battle. Exorcism is psychotherapy by massive assault. Like any massive assault, it is potentially quite dangerous. In exorcism, one is dealing with very high voltages, but the simple fact of its potential danger is hardly reason to outlaw it. Exorcism stands in relation to ordinary psychotherapy as radical surgery does to lancing a boil. Radical surgery can be not only healing but life-saving, and in fact may be the only way to heal in certain cases unresponsive to more conservative therapy. Difficult and dangerous though the exorcisms I witnessed were, I cannot imagine how else the two patients could have been healed. I have every reason to believe that had these two not had their exorcisms, they would, by now, be dead. The two persons were dramatically different people. One was hypomanic and intermittently psychotic before the exorcism. The other was neurotically depressed, but eminently sane. One was of average intelligence, the other of very superior intelligence. One was a loving parent, one an abusive parent. The one who looked sicker had the easier exorcism. The one who looked more sane had the deeper possession and the more ghastly struggle for healing. There was a unique flavor to each of their personalities. Yet some aspects of their possession and exorcism were strikingly similar. These similarities may serve as guidelines in understanding the nature of possession and exorcism. However, two cases do not a science make, and one should not expect a case to conform to such guidelines. From both these cases, I would conclude that possession is no accident. It appears to be a gradual process in which the possessed person repeatedly sells out for one reason or another. The primary reason both these patients sold out seemed to be loneliness. Each was terribly lonely, and each in the process adopted the demonic as a kind of imaginary companion. But there were also secondary reasons involved, reasons that I suspect might be primary in other cases. In one patient, the process seemed to begin with involvement in the occult at the age of 12. In the other, the process apparently began at the age of 5, with something more ghastly than what one would call ordinarily occult. Possession in both cases seemed to create what psychiatrists call fixation at the age of its onset. During the exorcism, one patient, when the healthy self was free to speak, gave the most poignant expression of fixation I have ever heard. "I haven't learned anything these past 20 years. I'm really just 12 years old. How can I possibly function after the exorcism? I'm way too young to be married and have children. How can I have sex and be a parent when I'm only 12? After the exorcism, the other patient, whose possession began at age 5, had to deal in intensive psychotherapy with all manner of 5-year-old fears, misconceptions, issues, and transferences.
Both patients were highly predisposed to their possession by multiple stresses before and after the onset of their possession. Both were victims of human evil as well as demonic evil. In particular, while both had been supported by the traditional church in some minor ways, each had been deeply hurt in major ways by evil people under the guise or auspices of the church. The diagnosis of possession is not an easy one to make. Neither of these two cases had bulging eyes or demonstrated any clearly supernatural phenomena before the exorcism proper. Both showed multiple manifestations of routine mental illness, such as depression or hysteria or loosening of associations. Authorities who encounter cases often like to ask, is the patient possessed, or is he or she mentally ill? It is not a valid question. As far as I can currently understand these matters, there has to be a significant emotional problem for the possession to occur in the first place. Then the possession itself will both enhance that problem and create new ones. The proper question is the patient just mentally ill, or is he or she mentally ill and possessed? In both cases, the major distinction in differential diagnosis was between possession and multiple personality disorder. In these cases, there were two distinguishing features. In multiple personality disorder, the core personality is virtually always unaware of the existence of the secondary personalities, at least until close to the very end of prolonged successful treatment. In other words, a true dissociation exists. In these two cases, however, both patients were either aware from the beginning or were readily made aware not only of the self-destructive part of them, but also that this part had a distinct and alien personality. Not that they were not confused by this secondary personality. To the contrary, it quickly became clear that the secondary personality desired to confuse them. In many ways, the secondary personality seemed like a personified resistance. It should be noted here that there are cases where both multiple personality and possession coexist, where the patient has both disorders simultaneously. The second differentiation is that while in multiple personality disorders, the secondary personality may play the role of the whore, or the aggressive one, or the independent one, or someone with other unacknowledged traits, it has never been reported to my knowledge as being frankly evil. In both these cases, before exorcism, the secondary personality was revealed to be blatantly evil. A crucial part in this diagnostic uncovering process was an attempted deliverance. Deliverance is a sort of mini-exorcism, frequently conducted over the past 2 decades by charismatic Christians to treat people suffering from, quote, oppression, unquote, defined as a sort of halfway state between demonic temptation, which the charismatics would say we all undergo, and frank possession. In one case, the deliverance itself was a failure, but when the patient was vigorously confronted afterward by a part of the deliverance team, which had originally numbered 4, an utterly evil persona temporarily emerged. The deliverance team of 3 in the second case was successful after 6 hours in identifying a lesser demonic spirit and in apparently casting it out. The patient, not a hysterical type of person in the least, experienced dramatic, extraordinary improvement for 6 weeks. But then the bottom fell out. Overnight, the patient regressed to severe life-threatening illness and shortly began to hear the voice of Lucifer. I can only speculate as to the reasons for the very temporary success of this deliverance. Ultimately, it is mysterious, but it did serve to strengthen our suspicion that the demonic was playing a major role in this person's illness. Something now must be said of the utmost importance. While both these patients demonstrated blatantly evil secondary personalities, they were not evil people. I never experienced either of them as evil. Not only did the core personality of each seem healthy, it seemed unusually good and potentially saintly. In fact, I admired both of these people very much even before the exorcisms. As I have indicated, they came to exorcism precisely because they had struggled against their possession for some years. A mature psychiatrist team member said, following one of the exorcisms, "I have never seen a person of such courage." Indeed, I have reason to suspect that the potential holiness of these two people was one of the reasons for their possession. Malachi Martin, in his book Hostage to the Devil, that describes quite well 5 cases of possession, has labeled the first and usually longest stage of an exorcism the pretense. What he meant by the pretense is that the demonic hides within and behind the person. For the exorcism to occur, the pretense must be broken. The demonic must be uncovered and brought into the open. The overriding question during the lengthy evaluation of both these patients was, is this person truly possessed? To answer this question and proceed to the exorcism proper, the pretense must be at least partially penetrated. During the evaluation, the core personality needs to be both educated and encouraged. The encouragement is particularly necessary toward the end, because it is my impression from these 2 cases that as the exorcism proper approaches, the demonic activity heats up and the patients experience considerable torment. Once the exorcism proper was begun, with appropriate prayer and ritual, in both these cases silence seemed to be the most effective of the many means used for the final penetration of the pretense. The team would speak either with the patient's healthy core personality or the demon, or demons, but would refuse to speak with some unclear mixture of the two. It took some time before the team in each case became adept at doing this, for the demon itself seemed to have a marked ability to draw the exorcist or team into confusing conversation that went nowhere. But as the team became more perceptive and steadfastly refused to be sucked in, both these patients began to alternate between a progressively more healthy-appearing core personality and a progressively more ugly secondary personality, until suddenly the secondary personality took on inhuman features, and the pretense was broken. The final stripping away of the pretense brought the team face to face with the demonic. As a hard-headed scientist, which I assume myself to be, I can explain 95% of what went on in these 2 cases by traditional psychiatric dynamics. But I am left with a critical 5% I cannot explain in such ways. I am left with the supernatural, or better yet, subnatural. I am left with the presence. When the demonic finally spoke clearly in one case, an expression appeared on the patient's face that could only be described as satanic. It was an incredibly contemptuous grin of utter hostile malevolence. I have spent many hours before a mirror trying to imitate it without the slightest success. I have seen the expression only one other time in my life, for a few fleeting seconds on the face of the other patient, late in the evaluation period. Yet when the demonic finally revealed itself in the exorcism of this other patient, it was with a still more ghastly expression. The patient suddenly resembled a writhing snake of great strength, viciously attempting to bite the team members. More frightening than the writhing body, however, was the face. The eyes were hooded with lazy reptilian torpor, except when the reptile darted out in attack, at which moment the eyes would open wide with blazing hatred. Despite these frequent darting moments, what upset me the most was the extraordinary sense of a 50-million-year-old heaviness I received from this serpentine being. It caused me to despair of the success of the exorcism. Almost all the team members at both exorcisms were convinced they were at these times in the presence of something absolutely alien and inhuman. The end of each exorcism proper was signaled by the departure of this presence from the patient and the room. The critical moment of the exorcism is what Martin calls the expulsion. It cannot be rushed. In both the exorcisms I witnessed, it was initially attempted prematurely. I cannot fully explain what happens at this moment, but I can state that the role of the exorcist in this moment is the least important. The desperate prayers of the team are more important. These prayers are for God or Christ to come to the rescue, and each time I had a sense that God did just that. As I said earlier, it is God that does the exorcising. But let me amend that. Human free will is basic. It takes precedence over healing. Even God cannot heal a person who does not want to be healed. At the moment of expulsion, both these patients voluntarily took the crucifix, held it to their chests, and prayed for deliverance. Both chose that moment to cast their lots with God. Ultimately, it is the patient herself or himself who is the exorcist. Satan does not easily let go. After its expulsion, it seems to hang around, desperately trying to get back in. In fact, in both cases, it very much looked for a short while as if the exorcism proper had failed. The patients had returned largely to their pre-exorcism condition. Nonetheless, within a few hours it was possible to discern a subtle but extraordinary change. All the old complexes were back in place, but it was as if the energy had gone out of them. The change was that now these patients could listen, and what they heard could now have an effect. In one case, psychotherapy became possible for the first time. In the other, more was accomplished in 50 hours of intense psychotherapy following the exorcism proper than in 500 hours preceding it. These patients moved extraordinarily fast. It was as if they were catching up for all those lost years. I feel it important to warn others that my experience of Satan demonstrates that it does not easily let go. Satan will not only tell the patient it is still around, but in one case repeatedly misled the patient into believing that it was still inside. In these cases, perhaps the greatest and most diabolic of all temptations, for both patient and exorcist, was to believe that the exorcism proper had been a failure, when in fact it had been a success. It seemed as if the exorcism proper moved the patients from a position of demonic possession to what has been called demonic attack. The tempting, threatening, and frightening voices that each heard were at least as active afterward as before. But, as one patient said, before it was like I was a little embryo, totally surrounded and hidden by them, so that I could not be me. Now I am me, and while I still hear the voices, they're coming from outside of me. Or, as the other said, before the voices were in control of me, now I'm in control of them. The voices only very gradually faded away for these patients. But what was not gradual was their improvement. Given the severity of their psychopathology before their exorcisms, the rapidity of their progress to health is not explainable in terms of what we know about the ordinary psychotherapeutic process. I have said that the presence of God was virtually palpable in the room. I do not think this was an accident. I suspect that whenever 7 to 10 people gather together at personal risk, motivated by love and healing, God will be there, as His Son assured us He would, and that healing will occur. Still, it is the patients who served as the very center and focal point of these happenings. I salute them. Through their torment and the courage of their struggle with Satan, they won a great victory, not only for themselves, but for many. Toward the end of one exorcism, in response to a comment that the spirit must really hate Jesus, the patient, with a full-blown satanic facial expression, said in a silky, oily voice, "We don't hate Jesus. We just test Him." In the middle of the other exorcism, when asked whether the possession was by multiple spirits, the patient with hooded, serpentine eyes answered quietly, almost in a hiss, "They all belong to me." As Martin points out, it is terribly important to understand that Satan is a spirit. I have said I have met Satan, and this is true, but it is not tangible in the way that matter is tangible. It no more has horns, hoofs, or a forked tail than God has a long white beard. Even the name Satan is just a name we have given to something basically nameless. Like God, Satan can manifest itself in and through material beings, but it itself is not material, nor is it even its manifestations. In the one case, it manifested itself through the patient's writhing serpentine body, biting teeth, scratching nails, and hooded reptilian eyes. But there were no fangs, no scales. It was through the use of the patient's body, extraordinarily and dramatically and even supernaturally snake-like. But it is not itself a snake. It is a spirit. Herein lies an answer, I suspect, to a question that has been asked through the ages. Why do demonic spirits have such an attachment to bodies? During one of the exorcisms I witnessed, the exorcist attempted to so enrage Satan that it would leave the possessed's restrained body to attack him, the exorcist. The maneuver did not work. Despite its obvious homicidal fury at the exorcist, nothing happened. And slowly it dawned on us that the spirit either could not or would not leave the patient's body under such conditions. This led us to two conclusions. One, already mentioned, is that ultimately the patient has to be the exorcist. The other is that Satan has no power except in a human body. Satan cannot do evil except through a human body. Although a murderer from the beginning, it cannot murder except with human hands. It does not have the power to kill or even harm by itself. It must use human beings to do its deviltry. Although it repeatedly threatened to kill the possessed and the exorcists, its threats were empty. Satan's threats are always empty. They are all lies. In fact, the only power that Satan has is through human belief in its lies. Both patients became possessed because they bought its false seductive promise of friendship. Possession was maintained because they believed its threats that they would die without it. And the possession was ended when both chose to believe its lies no longer, but to transcend their fear by trust in the resurrected Christ and to pray to the God of truth for deliverance. During each exorcism, Satan's lies were confronted, and each exorcism was concluded successfully by a conversion of sorts, a change of faith or value system. I now know what Jesus meant when he so frequently said, "By your faith you have been healed." So we are back to lies. Whatever relationship it might have to the people of the lie, I know no more accurate epithet for Satan than the father of lies. Throughout both exorcisms, it lied continually. Even when it revealed itself, it did so with half-truths. It was revealed to be the Antichrist when it said, "We don't hate Jesus, we just test him." But the reality is that it does hate Jesus. The list of lies it spoke was endless, sometimes almost a boring litany. Satan can use any human sin or weakness, greed and pride, for instance. It will use any available tactic, seduction, cajolery, flattery, intellectual argument. But its principal weapon is fear. And in the post-exorcism period, after its lies had been exposed, it was reduced to haunting both patients with dully repetitive threats. "We will kill you. We will get you. We will torture you. We will kill you." As well as being the father of lies, Satan may be said to be a spirit of mental illness. In The Road Less Traveled, I defined mental health as an ongoing process of dedication to reality at all costs. Satan is utterly dedicated to opposing that process. In fact, the best definition I have for Satan is that it is a real spirit of unreality. The paradoxical reality of this spirit must be recognized. Although intangible and immaterial, it has a personality, a true being. We must not fall back into St. Augustine's now discarded doctrine of the privatio boni, whereby evil was defined as the absence of good. Satan's personality cannot be characterized simply by an absence, a nothingness. It is true that there is an absence of love in its personality. It is also true, however, that pervading this personality is an active presence of hate. Satan wants to destroy us. It is important that we understand this. There are quite popular systems of thought these days, such as Christian Science or the Course in Miracles, which define evil as unreality. It is a half-truth. The spirit of evil is one of unreality, but it itself is real. It really exists. To think otherwise is to be misled. Indeed, as several have commented, perhaps Satan's best deception is its general success in concealing its own reality from the human mind. Although it has real power, Satan also has glaring weaknesses. Were it not for its extraordinary pride and narcissism, Satan would probably not reveal itself at all. Its pride overcomes its intelligence, so that the demon of deceit is also a show-off. If it had been thoroughly clever, it would have left the two patients long before their exorcisms. But it could not allow itself to lose. It wanted only to win. So in both cases it hung in there until the very bitter end, with the result that I and others today now know its reality. Satan's weaknesses should not encourage us to overlook its strength. It propounds its lies with extraordinary power. It may not be so remarkable that it possessed the two people I have described when they were lonely children. But in each exorcism I witnessed the exorcist, strong, mature, and faithful, temporarily incapacitated by confusion in one case and by despair in the other as a result of the power of its lies. For the sake of clarity, I have possibly talked about Satan with too much definitiveness. I describe the greater part of both exorcisms as a process of separation. Yet even at their clearest moments, it was often impossible to fully distinguish whether the voice talking was that of the patient's unconscious or one of a true demon. Perhaps it will forever be impossible to totally discern exactly where the human shadow leaves off and the Prince of Darkness begins. It is appropriate to conclude by focusing on the supernatural mystery of Satan. The evidence of the exorcisms was sufficient for me to become a believer in its existence, and I cannot deny the reality of the healing that occurred. But I am left with many more questions than before, too many even to detail. The most important question, however, is the role that Satan plays in human evil. What is the influence of Satan on thoroughly evil people, such as Bobby's parents in Book 1, and Sarah in Book 2? As I have said, both the possessed people I saw did not, like them, seem to me evil. And Martin correctly states that the rare cases we call possession should more properly be termed partial, incomplete, or imperfect possession. Martin suggests the hypothesis that, quote, perfectly possessed, unquote, human beings may exist, even abound, but he offers this hypothesis only as a highly tentative one. Could the thoroughly evil people I have described be cases of perfect possession? I do not know. Perhaps it is even a moot question. Since they are the least likely to submit themselves to psychotherapy, the truly evil are even less likely to undergo an exorcism through which the demonic would be fully discovered. If there is such a thing as perfect possession, it is highly likely to preclude its own revelation. So, I have no idea whether Satan actively recruits the commonly evil to its work. I suspect not. Given the dynamics of sin and narcissism, I suspect they recruit themselves. While I have endeavored to my utmost to be objective, I believe that the phenomena of possession and exorcism need to be studied scientifically. While genuine possession may be a rare phenomenon, the subject represents a veritable untapped gold mine for scientific unearthing. Hemophilia is a rare disease, but its study did much to illumine the whole physiology of blood clotting. In the same way, the study of possession and exorcism will further illumine not only the physiology of evil, but our very understanding of human meaning.